So I'm happy to see you. I'm glad you came back. Tonight, we are going to talk about anti-Semitism, definitions of anti-Semitism in relationship to Zionism. I have to tell you, as you might imagine, this is a challenging topic to talk about online and not in person because there is a lot of emotions, as you know, at stake. We are going to go over the two definitions that we sent out this week: the IHRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. And we're not going to decide which one is better. That would be impossible tonight. However, next week, we will talk about the politics of having these two definitions at odds with one another. Our goal tonight really is to understand the historical antecedents of this conversation and to know that it doesn't come out of nowhere and that each position comes from a point of view that is grounded historically. It's how they interpret that point of view. And so that's where we're going to find some of our emotions and tensions that I really do hope that you can hold for a little bit. I recognize that these things are real. They're just as real for me. But I want to learn where these definitions come from and how they operate today. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's see, play from the start. So today we're doing Israel and anti-Semitism, two definitions, two worldviews. And we're going to see how these worldviews relate to last class. Next week, we'll talk about definitions of engagement, of definitions of hate as political engagement, anti-Semitism in the 21st century. So we're going to see how these two definitions play a role in broader political schemes when we talk about anti-Semitism and what it is. So remember our course goals, and I want to revisit them so that we know what we're doing in this class. We want to have a better understanding of history and politics of defining anti-Semitism. We want to consider the contemporary political situation informing efforts to define anti-Semitism, which we're going to do a little bit today, and to encourage people to find ways to build interreligious coalitions to combat anti-Semitism, with and without a definition. I think this is important because how you define anti-Semitism may be how you define who is and isn't in your coalition to combat it. And so I want to imagine a place in which we can hold on to different definitions of anti-Semitism while combating it. And we'll see whether or not that's possible. So the agenda. And yes, it is a dense agenda, but given how complicated the relationship is to Zionism, I didn't want to surprise anyone here tonight with what we were doing. So this is a detailed outline of our evening. I'm going to give an introduction and a brief review. And then I'm going to talk about the Nazis and a new definition of anti-Semitism. What I want you to remember from last class is that when Wilhelm Marr defined anti-Semitism as a form of identity, anti-Semitism was seen as a positive. People were happily declaring themselves anti-Semites. In fact, for a proud German, to say that you're an anti-Semite was seen as a common good and goal. And so the Nazis are going to do something different with the term anti-Semitism, as we'll see. And there's a letter on May 17th, 1943, that I think is worth examining on how they change the definition of anti-Semitism and how that relates to the current Israeli-Palestinian issue today. And how these two definitions that we're going to study later come into being in some relationship to this historical moment. We're going to look very briefly at Joseph Goebbels and Alfred Rosenberg and their attempts to dismantle old definitions of anti-Semitism in order to create new ones. So anti-Semitism will no longer be seen as something that Germans are proud of, interestingly. And then for about 10 minutes, I want to look at how two different Israeli views of anti-Semitism from the 50s and 60s come into being, and how this debate informs what people talk about later as the new anti-Semitism. And real briefly, the new anti-Semitism, some people have argued that all of the tropes of Jews coming out of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, for instance, that attacking Jews as economic, political, cultural, or racially different, and that are part of a world conspiracy to dominate others, in the wake of the state of Israel, have now been transferred over to Israel on the international scene. So what the new anti-Semitism is arguing is that all the things that anti-Semites used to say about Jews, now they say about Israel. Israel becomes in some way the Jew, or the big Jew, or the collective Jew. And so we're going to see the debate as to whether or not this is a fair assessment of how Zionism and anti-Semitism operate politically. And so we're going to look at that argument very briefly. And then we're going to go into our breakout rooms, and we'll talk about definitions of anti-Semitism. In the second part of tonight, I want to give you some background on how the IHRA adoption of the working definition of anti-Semitism came into being. But then I want to read both definitions with you, and that's going to take about 10 or 15 minutes. But it's really important for us to hear the definitions so that we really understand the constitutive elements therein, as well as the arguments they're forming. They're both coming out of historical situations. They're both taking stances on how we talk about Zionism in relationship to anti-Semitism, and they're both very relevant to the contemporary context. So understanding each definition on their own terms is critical for us to understand how these definitions are going to operate later, so that next class we can talk about their afterlife in political and cultural contexts. We'll have a breakout room, we'll have some parting thoughts, and then we'll adjourn. Okay, so we're going to get started. I'm going to set my timer. I want to make sure that I stay on time. So here's a caveat. When we try to define anti-Semitism, our politics regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict can determine how we understand the term. This sounds obvious, but it's not always obvious to people who talk about it. And there's this quote from a scholar of anti-Semitism at Rhodes College, Jonathan Judakin. He writes that, like so much else in politics today, the debate about contemporary anti-Semitism is a dialogue of the death, waged as a battle to the death. Both sides are correct about a number of their claims, but neither can hear the truth of the other. And so these are his 10 commandments for thinking about modern anti-Semitism in 2018. So even the term anti-Semitism itself is bedeviled by definitional ambiguity, that it really depends on your situational context by which we're talking about anti-Semitism in relation to other forms of racism, and Zionism in relation to other forms of nationalism, and how they relate to one another. But that there's so much passion involved in how we talk about these issues, we default to not listening to one another. And I think a lot of us in this room can see how this happens. So here's a quick summary, very quick summary. In fact, 50 years in just 2 minutes. So Wilhelm Marr coins the term anti-Semitism in 1897. And as we remember, it's seen as an identity marker for Germans. To be German means that you are anti-Semitic, and that Jews should not be a part of German civil society. It's only the following year that Nathan Birnbaum coined the term Zionism. These two words have a destiny together, whether we like it or not. They come into being at the same historical moment. They interact with one another for the next 40 years. And each of the definitions of the term are complicated and politically charged. I put it out there to know that this is how it's been happening since both words came into being. None of this is new. Now, I think it's important for us to remember Theodor Fritsch in his anti-Semitic catechism, which was incredibly popular until his death in 1933, in which he had a set of commandments for being anti-Semitic. And people understood anti-Semitism is not hate, right? To be anti-Semitic was to be pro-German. Some have argued that follows the same trajectory of anti-Judaism, that to be Christian meant to be anti-Jewish. I think it's different only in the nationalist context because it's not a theological supersessionism, but rather an ethnocentrism in which some people cannot biologically or culturally exist with others. But his definition was clear: to oppose Semitism, the essence of the Jewish race. Right? So he's not going to be like Jews. And Wilhelm Marr was about discussing how Judaism contaminated Germanism. That anti-Semitism is the struggle against Semitism. It's the struggle for against Jewish emancipation. Jews cannot have equal rights in this particular society. 1903, we have the first publication of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this is where it gets very contentious. In the early 1920s, an Arabic translation of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion first appears. And this is a very tense moment in talking about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is an invention of Europe. It's an invention of the Christian West. It doesn't mean that in Muslim and Arab parts of the world that there were some anti-Jewish sentiments, but how that unfolded was dramatically different. And those of you who have studied the history of Jews in Arab and Muslim lands know that their situation was far better than it was in Europe. And so the translation of this document into the 1920s does change a certain attitude towards Jews, especially after the creation of the State of Israel. But it's not endemic, or endemic's the wrong word. It's not as inexorably woven into the history of those societies. It's a very relatively speaking, new phenomenon. And this is really important because when we talk about the new anti-Semitism, a lot of that direction is pointed eastward. And then there's an assumption that this is how it's always been. But the historical record doesn't actually support that point of view. It's a far more complicated ordeal. Nonetheless, it is translated and disseminated around the Arabic-speaking world. So the Nazis and a new definition of anti-Semitism. So I want to focus on this letter. This letter, sorry, trying to get my, so this letter is from Hans Hagemeyer to Dr. Koper. And I just gave you the document number from the text, just in case you're interested. I think they're all now digitized, so you can look these things up if you read German. I don't know if they're in English yet. But I think what's important is Fritzsch's catechism was still popular when the Nazis came to power, which meant that Nazis self-identified as anti-Semites. But in this letter, we see a move that the Nazi Party needed to change the language of anti-Semitism. And this letter explains why. Hagemeyer writes to Koper, referring to the meeting between the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, and Alfred Rosenberg. So the World War was extending into the Middle East. Um, British and the French had had soldiers and diplomats all over the region, and so Germany is trying to make alliances against, especially the British in the Middle East, and they want to have a relationship with this one individual in Jerusalem. And Rosenberg promises to issue instructions to the press to refrain from using the word anti-Semitism, which obviously blended Arabs and Jews together. He didn't want the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem to hear the word that they're proud anti-Semites when the assumption is that Arabs are Semites too. He didn't want the Grand Mufti to see that Germans saw Arabs and Jews as similar just because they were racially different. In fact, the term then got in the way of the political discourse, and they needed to find a new way to describe their political position regarding Jews. So the word also appeared in quotation marks so as not to insult the Mufti in the letter, who was a friend of the Germans, or to invite the accusation that the Germans were throwing Jews and Arabs into the same pot. Right, so they wanted to be a little bit more delicate in their diplomacy as they're trying to get his support. And so in 1944, Goebbels ordered the radio and the press to stop using the words Semitism and anti-Semitism, since they no longer suited the needs of the Third Reich. So there had to be a new way to talk about their hatred towards Jews and why Jews were no longer suited to be European. So he ordered them to use the words Jew and Judaism, anti-Jewish, or anti-Judaism. And so this is where it becomes complicated again, because we know that anti-Judaism is a theologically Christian trope that comes from antiquity to the present that refers to replacement theology, supersessionism, but very rarely, if ever, racism. In terms of the intentionalist historians, there's a link between anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism for sure. But this language then is referring back to Jews as religiously different. And Rosenberg and Goebbels were not attempting to create another definition in doing this. They just wanted to dismantle the current one in terms of realpolitik. What they wanted is a language that could be amenable to the allies that they were trying to court favor with in the Middle East without alienating them, while at the same time maintaining a hatred of Jews in Europe. So the Nazis are making a very important move here in terms of the language and the discourse. And so the end of the 19th century of definition of anti-Semitism occurs as the Nazis try to court favor with the Arab world. And so Nazi Germany wanted to have this categorical differentiation between Arabs and Jews. And it wasn't out of a particular love for Arabs, but it was simply because they were trying to find allies in a desperate moment of the war. This was due to signings of various agreements with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who made lengthy visits to Rome and Berlin. And they wanted to be sensitive about the language. And they also wanted to show that they were trustworthy. The Arabs who were Semites were now allies, could no longer be included in such hostile or negative definitions. And the Nazis had to do a lot of work within their ranks to prevent other Nazis from indulging in these racist caricatures of both Arabs and Jews. So a lot of work was done in terms of the propaganda and also in the manuals on how to discuss each. And there's even in terms of the racial science, they start to make differentiations with photographs about noses and all of those horrible depictions. But in their mind, the terms Jew and Judaism were clearer eternal enemies, especially by 1944, since the extermination camps were in full swing. Now, this is also a time in which we see the word Jew become this pejorative in a way, right? That to talk about Jews negatively becomes a form of identity. And so the verbiage, right, of Jewing and Judaizing and all of these things that had happened in Europe, they want to return to that as a part of the discourse, as a way of maintaining these political relationships. Okay. And I know I went through that quickly. In your bibliography, there's a lot to read, and there's a lot of great scholarship and literature on it. But I just wanted you to get a sense that these are the meetings that people focus on when they start talking about their definitions of anti-Semitism. These meetings happened, the relationship was there. The intentionality from both parties is debatable. You know that, well, I'll save that for next class. There'll be a distraction. So now I want to share with you two definitions of anti-Semitism that come about 15 years later. And this is a classic Zionist definition of anti-Semitism. And just looking at the title, I realized that's a problem, because I'm saying that there's something classic, even though the word Zionist and anti-Semitism are really difficult terms to define. So how could there be some classic definition when I've already argued that there isn't one? But it's a good title. But anti-Semitism contains, quote, hatred of the other, hatred of the alien, and hatred of the weak in a more forceful and consistent form than other forms of hatred of minorities. This definition comes from Ben-Zion Netanyahu in 1959 in the Hebrew Encyclopedia. He is the father of the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin or Bibi Netanyahu. And he writes a definition of anti-Semitism that follows in the path not of the Nazis, but of Herzl. It's a view of anti-Semitism that requires Zionism to be the solution. For him, a state of being different, alien, and weak can be changed through the abolition of the diaspora and the establishment of a Jewish state. So remember, in the 19th century, if language, blood, and land can determine identity, and that the full creative identity is in the formation of a state that incorporates all three of those things, and that Jews, because they're perceived to not have any of those things, are then dehumanized and as stateless, as not sharing the same language, not sharing the same land, they become less human, less creative. Zionism will change all of that, because it normalizes the Jewish people in a way that takes away the conditions for anti-Semitism in Europe, because you can't say that Jews aren't any of those things when they become them, or when they flourish in that capacity. It's a very optimistic view of Zionism. Once Jews have a state, their status in other lands becomes one living outside their homeland. They're immigrants. This was important to Netanyahu. The problem for him of anti-Semitism is that Jews residing in lands that were not their homeland were perceived as resident aliens, but not from any one place in particular. There's the awkward scenario, especially with the rise of nationalism, that Jews had been living in particular European lands longer than the people who claim them. The one poignant and ironic example is Germany. Jews had been living in Germanic lands, or what were or now called Germanic lands, from the time of the Roman Empire in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, before the Germanic tribes had taken over those particular places. So it's an awkward scenario in which you're talking about nationalism in a relationship to land, culture, blood, and all of the things that are related to some pseudo-natural environment, but Jews were perceived on the outside. But once Jews have a state, they're immigrants, so they can participate in society without anti-Semitism because you know where they come from, you know who they are, and you become more tolerant of them. This was according to Netanyahu, not according to any sort of observation that actually happens in the real world. They would no longer be foreigners different than any other immigrants. So again, a very optimistic point of view. There would be the Irish, the Jewish, the British, the French, and that on a spectrum of difference, they would all be equally different, that there would be nothing suspicious or different about Jews. Because if you remember from the last class, Jews in Germany and Jews in France had relationships to one another, but both French and Germans didn't want those relationships to endure. They wanted Frenchness to come before Jewishness, or Germanness to become before Frenchness. Hence, we also have the Dreyfus affair that explores that in a really dramatic and anti-Semitic fashion. And as soon as the state flourished, Jews would draw strength from it and take pride in it, so that the state itself would become a place where Jews can also create an identity, and that identity would allow them to flourish in places in society where they hadn't previously. And when the state of Israel comes to existence, it would eliminate the elements that had given rise to anti-Semitism. The reason why this is a classic Zionist definition of anti-Semitism, because this was Herzl's dream, that Zionism would eliminate the conditions for anti-Semitism and thus eliminate anti-Semitism. Now, the Israeli historian Shmuel Ettinger had a different approach. And so after the 1967 war, in which Jewish and Israeli self-identity started to take root in different ways that didn't really have the kind of historical precedent other forms of identity had, he argued that anti-Semitism is an intrinsic part of Western culture. So like Lucian Wolff in the last class, the anti-Jewish components of Western civilization didn't disappear with anti-Semitism. It just became a reified form of prejudice. But that anti-Semitism for him is much larger than just the hatred of Jewish people. It's the idea that you can create hierarchies within people and create a binary worldview in which there are people who are civilized and people who are uncivilized. It's anti-Semitism is, in his mind, something that justified things like colonialism and imperialism, and that these aren't things that you can take away just by having a state or participating in the machinations of everyday state-like activity. There is no normalcy with anti-Semitism, because just like democracy is a part of Western culture, so is anti-Semitism, right? It's the paradox of Western civilization. It's the civilization that benefited from and produced slavery, and has at the same time talks about freedom, right? So it's a paradox that is irreconcilable for Ettinger, and so he's not really interested in trying to solve the problem of anti-Semitism. So for him, Zionism couldn't solve or diminish the problem of anti-Semitism, because the image of the Jew and the image of the state of Israel for him and the citizens existed separately. That within 2 generations in the state of Israel, there was an Israeli identity that was moving in a direction that wasn't in the same vein as conventional liberal Judaism, right? It was an identity that was becoming nationalistic. And so to talk about the citizens of Israel and the nationalism in Israel in the same way as the caricatures of the image of the Jew wasn't tenable for him. Then we get to the 1970s. So the new anti-Semitism. Now, people date the new anti-Semitism much later, but the term itself appears with Abba Eban in speaking at the UN. And so I wanted to share this quote and what he thinks the new anti-Semitism is. Recently, we have witnessed the rise of the new left. And when he talks about the new left, he's also talking about the Soviet Union, which identifies Israel with the establishment, with acquisition, with smug satisfaction, with, in fact, all the basic enemies. Let there be no mistake, the new left is the author and progenitor of the new anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism is merely the new anti-Semitism. So the idea that I talked about in the very beginning, that the state itself becomes a reified version of the caricature of the Jew, Eban is making policy. He's going to say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism because the rhetoric that you see, the anti-Semitic rhetoric that you see, and especially with the Soviet Union, and when he's talking about the Soviet Union, is a way to demonize the state in the way that Europe used to demonize Jews. And then 2 years later, the Soviet Union, with sponsorship from a number of Arab countries, puts forth the UN resolution 3379. And those that study this history know that it's quite famous, in which it states that Zionism is racism and racial discrimination. And that's where the Zionism is racism platform takes off. And Chaim Herzog, speaking at the UN, says, we are seeing what we are seeing here today, but another manifestation of the bitter anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish hatred which animates Arab society. So he's now talking about the greater Arab world, right? So it's becoming an Arab problem and not necessarily a European one. Who would have believed that in this year, 1975, the malicious falsehoods of the Elders of Zion would be distributed officially by Arab governments? Who would have believed that we would today contemplate an Arab society which teaches the vilest anti-Jewish hate in the kindergartens? We are being attacked by a society which is motivated by the most extreme form of racism known in the world today. And so what he's doing is he is focusing on the classic definitions of anti-Semitism, these caricatures, and he's using it as a way to defend himself against policy, right? So to suggest that Zionism is racism, is both anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic, is starting to use definitions of anti-Semitism as a way of combating political dissent or political provocation, because it's all going to become anti-Semitic. And this is where there was some pushback back and forth. The reality of the resolution, and most historians seem to agree on this, is that the Russians were trying to use this document not really to vilify Israel, although it was doing that, but as a way of justifying domestic anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, to suggest that Jews were not loyal to other Soviets, that they were in fact loyal to a racist endeavor in Israel, and that it was a way to persecute Jews within the Soviet Union as a form of policy, and playing on these anti-Semitic tropes. So this is where we get the background for the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as part of this narrative. And Daniel Patrick Moynihan lamented famously that the United Nations was about to make anti-Semitism into international law. But this didn't come without pushback. So, and it came from pushback largely from a lot of Jewish scholars of the Holocaust. They were very uncomfortable with the language of anti-Zionism being conflated with anti-Semitism, because one, they weren't always sure what anti-Zionism meant, But it seemed like a lot of the criticism from anti-Zionism had to do with the occupation of 1967, and then the occupation, and then much later, but the occupation of Gaza, and then the treatment of Palestinians in what became Area A, B, and C of the West Bank. And so there was concern that Palestinian self-determination, by its very nature, in living in an occupied territory, would most likely be anti-Zionist, especially if you're part of a national liberation movement for self-determination. That means that any sort of discourse that comes from Palestinian society, according to the critics, would be accused of being anti-Semitic, that Palestinian self-identity would become a form of anti-Semitism. And so they were concerned that this was a way of not dealing with a political conflict, but also in a way moving away from practical definitions of anti-Semitism. So Helen Fine, a scholar of genocide studies, writes in 1991 that although neither anti-Zionism nor criticism of Israel is necessarily anti-Semitic, Zionists is very often used as a code word for Jews. And so she recognizes the complexity of the discourse that at times Zionists are talked about in the way that people talk about Jews anti-Semitically. And this depends on context and effect. So context is going to be very important for the critics of the new anti-Semitism. Context matters. Some Jewish organizations have interpreted all criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic, right? So even today, I'll just say that today sometimes we hear that not all criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, but only legitimate criticism. So who gets to police what is legitimate criticism of Israel is the concern. If you default that there is criticism writ large that is anti-Semitic and that we have to decipher what is and isn't, that's not really going to lead to any sort of practical solutions politically. And so she's concerned. But branding all those who criticize Israel as anti-Semites blurs the issue. Moreover, it could become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So she's concerned that the accusation of anti-Semitism will ultimately take power away from the accusation if everyone who criticizes Israel or is not a Zionist becomes an anti-Semite. And then Brian Klug, a British Jewish ethicist, wrote, "When Zionism is everywhere, it is nowhere." Or when anti-Semitism is everywhere, it is nowhere. And when every anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite, we no longer know how to recognize the real thing. The concept of anti-Semitism loses its significance. The problem with anti-Semitism for Klug and to some extent for Fine is that anti-Semitism is a part of civilization in a way that it plays a role in our discourse. It plays in the role in way we stereotype. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion was a powerful document in which it took prejudice and ideas about Jews and turned them into policy without any sort of relationship to the empirical world. Jews were who they said they were, regardless of what Jews did. The problem for them is that the state of Israel is a real thing. And like every other state, it conducts its activities in moral and immoral ways. As a state, it is guilty of propaganda like other states. And as a state, it engages in things that not all of its citizens will agree with. The state is real. It is a real entity where there are Jews. It's not abstract. And so when you talk about a state in the way that you talk about other human beings, it takes away the reality of what's going on. And that's their fear. And so what we have now are these two separate worldviews concerning how Zionism and anti-Semitism relate. Before I send you to your breakout rooms, I just want to add one other element here, is that it has to do with the tension disclosed by Rosa Luxemburg in last class. shouldn't we be combating racism everywhere for Luxemburg and seeing anti-Semitism as part of that? The problem is that anti-Semitism, if it's foundational, all racism is going to be situational. And so if all racism is situational, you're always going to have to find the context by how this racism is operating. And that's where the tension is going to lie when these two definitions become more catalyzed in people's political thinking. So with that in mind, I'm going to stop the share, or we'll go into our breakout rooms, and then I'll stop the share. Your breakout room. Given the last class and a half, do you think a clear universal definition is possible? And remember, each of you is going to be talking and listening in a much more emotional environment tonight than you would be in other situations. So let's do our best to ask clarifying questions. We're not going to figure this out tonight, but I want you to probe a little bit whether or not such a definition could be possible. Or welcome back. I hope that you were able to, in a few minutes, try to answer, a fairly simple question with not simple answers. What we're going to do now, and it's really only going to take about 20 minutes, and then we're going to go back to our breakout rooms. So I'm going to give you the background to how the working definition of anti-Semitism came into being. We're going to read it after the IHRA adoption of it. And then we're going to read the response by the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism. What I want you to keep in mind is that the two narratives that I shared in the beginning are going to play a role in these two definitions. And we're going to see how that works. So the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the CSCE, later replaced by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, started to take anti-Semitism in Europe very seriously. So you had part of the problem is that the associations between East and West weren't always making sense in Europe. While Russia had a lot of anti-Semitism, Eastern Germany had less. In fact, Eastern Germany as a country was less hospitable to Nazis than West Germany. And so what we started to see is that you had Western European anti-Semitism and Eastern European anti-Semitism, not always making sense politically, start to manifest in violence. And so that we get this report in 1992 in Copenhagen that's denouncing the rise of anti-Semitism. So they know what's going on. It's Jews are being attacked, but they don't really have the language legally to describe what it is. And this report inspired the need for definition, since before legislating, one needs a definition. So in Europe, because they're still operating in the wake of the Holocaust, they're still thinking about the legacy of the Holocaust. They want to be clear as a Western society how they can maintain things like freedom of speech while not protecting and preserving hate speech. And so the following year at a UN conference on human rights in Vienna, all the delegations were required to reach a solution stating that anti-Semitism was a form of racism. How they got there was going to be different, but they needed to reach some solution saying that it was racism, that it wasn't just anti-Judaism. A few years later, and this is also during the Second Intifada, the 2001 UN World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, the delegations were there to define racism. But as a surprise to probably no one in the room, no definition of racism was acceptable to all delegations. So racism had to take into account colonialism. It had to take into account prejudice. It had to take into account power. So, for instance, one of the main issues in this argument was, can minorities be racist? And for some delegations, they could not because they had no power to act on their racism, but they could be prejudiced. And so they wanted to make these distinctions between prejudice and racist. And so the context by which racism operated became central to these disagreements. And as a result, anti-Semitism remained undefined. And there was more focus at this conference on the politics regarding Israel's policy towards Palestinians at the time. So that created some tension, especially in regards to people who believed in the new anti-Semitism. But January of 2005, we get the working definition of anti-Semitism. And at the time, this is really the first definition of anti-Semitism that comes onto the scene for about 30 or 40 years. And so what is this working definition of anti-Semitism? After many failed attempts to define anti-Semitism, the European Union Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, the EUMC, joined the OSCE, and there'll be a quiz at the end for all of these terms. When you do international law, especially with Europe, there are all these four-letter abbreviations that people seem to memorize. But the EUMC joined the OSCE's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the ODIHR, to formulate a better definition. And as a result, a new working definition of anti-Semitism came into being. Working definition here meant a practical tool rather than an academic or theoretical exercise. Because remember, they're writing a definition so that they can legislate against anti-Semitism in Europe. And so the 2005 working definition of anti-Semitism, it deviates from previous definitions and does so consciously. It does not deal with the image of the Jew, but rather with anti-Semitic activities. And we're going to see when we read it how this operates. It doesn't mention Judaism and addressed the new anti-Semitism. And for many readers, it suggests that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Now, I put this line in here because this is an accusation against the working definition of anti-Semitism, but the sentence doesn't exist. That statement, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, is not there. But for critics, and you will decide yourself whether or not this is true. So what I want to do for the remainder of our time is I want to take the next 10 to 15 minutes, and I want to read to you these two definitions. And I have images that go along with these definitions, and I'll pause and explain those images at various points. But it is important because people talk about these definitions all the time, but they very rarely read them. And I also want you to keep in mind as I read them, the very brief and quick history that I shared in the first part and the history from last class, how they're informing these definitions. So the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance adopts the working definition of anti-Semitism. And this organization, these are three parts of their mission statement. They educate. So the working groups and committee publishes educational recommendations to help guide teachers and organizations. The IHRA is the only intergovernmental organization mandated to focus solely on Holocaust-related issues. The IHRA member countries have pledged to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust, honoring their legacy and memory. So we know at least what the IHRA's mission is. And so how, and so they're going to adopt this definition of anti-Semitism to inform how they do their work. So I'm going to start reading. There isn't a test at the end, and I think some of you read it in the beginning, but just keep in mind the language that we've talked about earlier. To guide the IHRA in its work, the following examples may serve as illustrations. Manifestations might include the targeting of the State of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity. I want you to notice they do start with Israel. Moreover, or however, criticism of Israel similar to that levied against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, and it is often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. It is expressed in speech, writing, visual forms, and action, and employs sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. Contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and in the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include, but are not limited to, calling for, aiding, or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion, making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews, such as such, or the power of Jews as a collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. So if you look at the image that I have above, it's a pig that's feeding all the piglets. And that pig is Rothschild, because Rothschild is the bank that funds all of these world governments. But as you see in a classic Great Britain, right? So the Rothschilds can manipulate and feed all of these groups because they're the ones in control. That is an anti-Semitic image. And what this particular paragraph is suggesting is that when you talk about the State of Israel, or when you talk about Rothschild and replace it with the State of Israel in any sentence you can imagine, if they're interchangeable, then they're going to be anti-Semitic. If the State of Israel becomes Rothschild in that image, it's going to be anti-Semitic. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. So the image that you see in the middle, cultural Marxism, is very popular, at least with anti-Semites from the that are nationalist, or what we might call right-wing. That the cultural Marxism is where we get ideas like feminism, structural racism, equity, DEI, the things that are perceived to be as undermining good civilized Christian society. Cultural Marxism becomes the boogeyman, that these are culturally Marxist points of view. And it also goes without definition as to what cultural Marxism actually is. But you see the Soviet symbol with the red fist punching America in the face, and there's the Jew in the front. And if you remember from the Protocols of the Elders of Zion earlier, Jews manipulate other minorities to take out and to undermine culture. And so that's remaining the same for the IHRA, or the conspiracies that the Jews did 9/11 or anything like that. Denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, i.e. gas chambers, or the intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of the National Socialists, Germany, and its supporters and accomplices during World War II. So Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. I don't know that the gentleman in the picture there was a Holocaust denier, but it was an odd sweatshirt that he was wearing at the Capitol riot. And so he is anti-Semitic according to this definition. The Holocaust is a big lie. So as you see, it's the golden calf, or sometimes a Trojan horse. but we're starting to get a sense of where it's going. Accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. And so this is actually a very common view for anti-Semites, that there was no Holocaust, that it was invented to justify the state of Israel. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. Dual loyalty, or the state within a state that we learned about last week. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, i.e., by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. This is an interesting move, right? So to say that Zionism is racism or that the state of Israel is racist, according to this definition, is anti-Semitic. So you can imagine where the pushback might be from people who disagreed with that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Applying double standards by requiring it of a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. So the double standards argument that we hear, that why are we talking about the persecution of people here when you don't talk about the persecution of people there? Why are we, the whatabouts? Double standards it's a code word also against, and we'll talk about this next week, Natan Sharansky's argument of what makes something anti-Semitic in terms of critical of Israel. And so it's drawing attention to that. And we'll talk about that next week. Using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, i.e. claims of Jews killing Jesus or the blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. So in the picture on the far right is a picture of the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ariel Sharon, eating Palestinian children. So according to this definition, that image is anti-Semitic. Drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. So the image beneath that, according to this definition, is anti-Semitic. Holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. Anti-Semitic acts are criminal when they are so defined by law. For example, denial of the Holocaust or distribution of anti-Semitic materials in some countries. Criminal acts are anti-Semitic when the targets of attacks, whether they are school, property, people, such as buildings, schools, places of worship, and cemeteries, are selected because they are or perceived to be Jewish or linked to Jews. So in the image that I have to the right, Free Palestine is not an anti-Semitic phrase, according to this document. But if you spray paint it onto a synagogue, it becomes anti-Semitic because you're making an assumption about the people in that building that may or may not be connected to the policies that you're advocating against. The F Israel part is also, when it's spray painted on a synagogue, is irrefutably anti-Semitic according to the IHRA definition. And then the denial to Jews of opportunities or services available to others and is illegal in many countries, right? Can't discriminate against Jews. So Kenneth Stern previously served as the lead drafter of the International Holocaust Remembrance Working Definition of Anti-Semitism. And he writes a lot about this. He's holding his book, The Conflict Over the Conflict, about Israel-Palestine conversations and debates on campuses, on college campuses. But in December 2019, he expressed concern that right-wing Jewish groups and national governments were using the document to silence what he regarded as legitimate criticisms of Israel. Stern also claimed that the U.S. President Trump's 2019 executive order on combating anti-Semitism would stifle Palestinian free speech rather than protect Jewish students. And in December 2020, he urged the incoming Biden administration not to adopt the IHRA working definition, claiming that it had been weaponized by pro-Israel lobby groups to silence criticism of Israel. And so the next document that we're going to read is in the spirit of Stern's critique. You're going to notice a lot of similarities up into the last 5 points. And so this is from their website. The JDA responds to the working definition of anti-Semitism adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance in 2016. The IHRA definition, including its examples, is neither clear nor coherent. Whatever the intentions of its proponents, it blurs the difference between anti-Semitic speech and legitimate criticism of Israel and Zionism. This causes confusion while delegitimizing the voices of Palestinians and others, including Jews who hold views that are sharply critical of Israel and Zionism. None of this helps combat anti-Semitism. The JDA responds to the situation. So they ask themselves, so is the JDA intended to be an alternative to the IHRA working definition? Yes, it is. People of goodwill seek guidance about the key question: when does political speech about Israel or Zionism cross the line into anti-Semitism, and when should it be protected? The JDA is intended to provide this guidance, and so should be seen as a substitute for the IHRA definition. But if an organization has formally adopted the IHRA definition, it can use the JDA as a corrective to overcome the shortcomings of the IHRA definition. So here are the first 5 general guidelines. Definition: anti-Semitism is discrimination, prejudice, hostility, or violence against Jews as Jews, or Jewish institutions as Jewish. 1. It is racist to essentialize, treat a character trait as inherent, or make sweeping negative generalizations about a given population. What is true of racism in general is true of anti-Semitism in particular. So it's already going to put this conversation in relationship to other conversations about racism. What is particular in classic anti-Semitism is the idea that Jews are linked to the forces of evil. This stands at the core of many anti-Jewish fantasies, such as the idea of a Jewish conspiracy, in which the Jews possess hidden power that they use to promote their own collective agenda at the expense of other people. This linkage between Jews and evil continues in the present, in the fantasy that the Jews control governments, and with a hidden hand, that they own banks, control the media, act as a state within a state, and are responsible for spreading disease, such as COVID-19. All of these features can be instrumentalized by different and even antagonistic political causes, right? So people from the left, people from the right, they can all use these anti-Semitic tropes. Anti-Semitism can be manifested in words, visual images, and deeds. Examples of anti-Semitic words include utterances that all Jews are wealthy, inherently stingy, or unpatriotic. In anti-Semitic caricatures, Jews are often depicted as grotesque, with big noses and associated with wealth. Examples of anti-Semitic deeds are assaulting someone because she or he is Jewish, attacking a synagogue, delving swastikas on Jewish graves, or refusing to hire or promote people because they are Jewish. Anti-Semitism can be direct or indirect, explicit or coded. For example, the Rothschilds controlled the world is a coded statement about the alleged power of the Jews over banks and international finance. Similarly, portraying Israel as the ultimate evil or grossly exaggerating its actual influence can be a coded way of racializing and stigmatizing Jews. In many cases, identifying coded speech is a matter of context and judgment, taking into account of these guidelines. Denying or minimalizing the Holocaust by claiming that the deliberate Nazi genocide of the Jews did not take place, or that there were no extermination camps or gas chambers, or that the number of victims was a fraction of the actual total, is anti-Semitic. So let's look at the next 5. Israel and Palestine, examples that on the face of it are anti-Semitic. Applying the symbols, images, and negative stereotypes of classical anti-Semitism, see guidelines 2 and 3, to the state of Israel. So remember, if you can replace Rothschild with the state of Israel in any sentence, you're most likely going to come to the conclusion that that critique is anti-Semitic. Holding Jews collectively responsible for Israel's conduct, or treating Jews simply because they are Jewish as agents of Israel. Requiring people because they are Jewish publicly to condemn Israel or Zionism, for example, at a political meeting. There was a famous example of this where the Jewish artist Netanyahu was performing in Spain. Netanyahu is not someone that has shared his positions on the state of Israel or the conflict, but was required to publicly denounce the state of Israel's policy towards Palestinians in order to be able to perform at his concert. So according to this definition, that would be anti-Semitic. Assuming that non-Israeli Jews, simply because they are Jews, are necessarily more loyal to Israel than their own countries, and denying the right of Jews in the state of Israel to exist and flourish collectively and individually as Jews in accordance with the principle of equality. But here's the final part that makes this definition different. Israel and Palestine examples that, on the face of it, are not anti-Semitic. Whether or not one approves the view or action, supporting the Palestinian demand for justice and the full grant of their political, national, civil, and human rights as encapsulated in international law, criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism, or arguing for a variety of constitutional arrangements for Jews and Palestinians in the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. It is not anti-Semitic to support arrangements that accord full equality to all inhabitants between the river and the sea, whether in two states, a binational state, a unitary democratic state, federal state, or in whatever form. So for them, to suggest something like Israel as an apartheid state is not an anti-Semitic statement. It's a criticism of Israel that should be protected in terms of its speech. Evidence-based criticism of Israel as a state. This includes, and the image is a very popular image that we see on the internet that we're going to see for the JDA is not anti-Semitic according to their definition. This includes its institutions and founding principles. It also includes its policies and practices, domestic and abroad, such as the conduct of Israel in the West Bank and Gaza, the role Israel plays in the region, or any other way in which as a state it influences in the world. It is not anti-Semitic to point out the systematic racial discrimination. In general, the same norms of debate that apply to other states and to other conflicts over national self-determination apply in the case of Israel and Palestine. Thus, even if contentious, it is not anti-Semitic in and of itself to compare Israel with other historical cases, including settler colonialism or apartheid. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions are commonplace, nonviolent forms of political protest against states. In the Israeli case, they are not in and of themselves anti-Semitic. So this is an assertion that obviously is going to be very contentious given all of the moves against the BDS movement and the perception that is anti-Semitic. So we're going to see that there is a fundamental disagreement between these definitions of anti-Semitism. And finally, and I think this is an interesting point that they end on, political speech does not have to be measured, proportional, tempered, or reasonable to be protected under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights and other human rights instruments. Criticism that some may see as excessive or contentious or as reflecting a double standard is not in and of itself anti-Semitic. In general, the line between anti-Semitic and non-anti-Semitic speech is different from the line between unreasonable and reasonable speech. So you can see the woman holding the sign, everything about Israel is illegal. According to the IHRA document, that is an anti-Semitic sign. According to the JDA definition of anti-Semitism, it is not. So we see how these two definitions operate within this political sphere. Okay, we do have time for about a 6-minute breakout room. I think it's important just for you to hear one another. I just want you to take a minute and collect your thoughts. This will be an exercise in listening. So maybe just give us another 5 minutes to end just a little bit later. Assign a timekeeper. Each person take 1 minute to share what's on their mind. There's a lot that's been swirling around. I've just inundated you with a lot of definitions. Take a breath and just share with your interlocutors what's on your mind. No one is allowed to respond to anyone. You're all going to sit in silence. Each person is going to take that minute. You're just going to share. You're going to speak only about your thoughts and emotions. That means that whoever goes second, third, fourth, and fifth, you're not responding to anyone else's. This is an exercise in listening. After getting all of this information, it's just nice to pause for a moment and hear what people are feeling and thinking, and that the people have an opportunity to express it without having to deal with any response to it. So let's go to our breakout rooms, assign a timekeeper, and let's take 1 minute to share what's on our minds. And then we'll come back at 8:29, and then we'll sum up everything and get ready for the next class. Okay? All right, good. So I'll see you soon. It probably wasn't enough time, and I apologize. I'm going to put in some time next class for us to continue that conversation, because I do think it's an important one. Because next week we're going to talk about the political implications of having these two definitions and what it does to our political discourse. One thing I want to share, though, before we leave tonight, is that this is not a right-wing versus left-wing debate. As I was just sharing with my colleagues earlier, both people from the political left and the political right support and authored both documents. So you have people on the left that support IHRA and JDA, and people on the right who support IHRA and JDA. So it's a different understanding of politics. But hopefully this exercise was one in which we teach ourselves to at least listen for a moment. This is a lot of material and it's heavy, but I'm glad that we can at least start exploring these definitions together. Next week, so there's no assigned reading. Next week, we're going to talk about these political implications, and I'm going to reserve some more time for breakout room conversations so that we can continue this. And I will try to go less on the content. I'll slow down a little bit. I'll have fewer slides and look at some of the bigger issues. Thank you for staying with me. It's good to see all of you. Wishing you a wonderful week, and I'll see you next week. Thank you.